What this means is you can't think of these problem in binaries and say, I have a strategy for cold start and I have a strategy for everybody else. You have to think of a strategy that's like a sliding scale. What it really means is something like this, right? That you want to exploit every little bit of information that you know, but with the realization that you know very little for a whole bunch of your customers. And then for some of them, you know a little bit more, which means you need to sort of balance this idea of exploiting what you know while still keeping the door open to explore what you don't.
Hello and welcome to the AI Master Group podcast, featuring the people who are building the future of AI in their work today. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. Today, I'm very happy to have as a guest on this show, Ramsu Sundararajan, who's the Head of R&D at solus.ai, which empowers segment of one personalization. Previously, Ramsu was faculty at the Indian Institute of Management, and prior to that, he was a principal at Sabre Airline Solutions, where he developed some of the original algorithms there. Prior to that, he was a senior scientist at GE Global Research. Ramsu has his PhD from the Indian Institute of Management with a specialization in machine learning. Welcome, Ramsu.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's lovely to be here.
It is great to have a chance to reconnect with you. Of course, I know you very well. We've worked together over the years, and you've worked in some very important roles at some notable brands prior to when I came to know you. Can you describe a little bit of that work?
I became a data scientist professionally around 2003 when I was close to finishing up my PhD work at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. And pretty much since then, I have been in search of patterns in data. I started off looking for patterns in financial services data, looking at customer behavior for the consumer finance side of the GE Capital business, and then moved on to look at patterns in diagnostic images like X-rays and MRI and CT scans and so on to see whether or not we could find markers for diseases. For instance, I worked on a project where we were trying to find patterns in chest X-rays that would identify very early the presence of black lung disease in coal miners in China. And after that, I ended up looking at patterns in turbines that might indicate that a turbine was beginning to either perform at less than peak efficiency or that would indicate that a turbine was headed for some kind of catastrophic failure and needed to be shut down early so that critical maintenance could be performed. Then I was looking at patterns in aircraft engine data and then back to financial services. So I was just bouncing around GE, and being in global research in a diversified conglomerate like GE allowed me to look at various domains when I did that. After about 11 odd years of that, I moved to Sabre Airline Solutions, where I looked at patterns in passenger behavior to see whether or not people had certain preferences that would indicate the kind of travel they would do and would have an impact on pricing and the kind of bundling that you could do for products and so on and so forth. I spent about 3 years doing that, and then I moved to Cartesian Consulting, which then morphed into solus.ai, which is where I am now. So since then, I've been looking at patterns in retail, banking, um, QSR, and a bunch of other verticals. So that's been the journey. It's pretty much just been looking at data and trying to see, can I find something here? Mostly algorithmically, but in the process also in a very ad hoc manner.
That's very interesting the way you've framed it as looking for patterns. It's a very intuitive description. So now that you've talked about Solus a little bit, the segment of one, retail, banking, and so forth. I remember we were working on some of the foundational aspects of that technology, at least as far back as 2018. Can you tell me a little bit about the journey that you've been on from idea to product?
I think the birth of Solus as an idea in the team came from a recommender algorithm that was built, which was pretty much a basic lookalike algorithm. It's part of Solus now. It's called the genome algorithm, where what happened was that we said, listen, let's characterize every customer in terms of a set of features and call it the customer genome. Then we start treating each customer as the center of the universe and try and see who are the customers who are similar to this fellow. And that would give us a clue on what could be recommended to this person. So that was the start. And then we said, listen, there's probably a lot more here that we could do. So that was, the first entry into the rabbit hole. And then once we started getting deeper and deeper, we understood a few things. One is that up until then, as an analytics consulting firm, we were doing a lot of CRM work for a lot of clients, and there were very common patterns in terms of the kind of work we were doing, which meant that there was a natural shift towards productizing some of what we were doing for them anyway. So part of the idea of the product came from the whole notion of building recommenders and so on, and essentially building something that was hyper personalized. Part of it came from the fact that for a variety of clients, we were anyway doing a lot of very standard CRM work, which could then be, again, packaged and productized. So when these things started coming together, it gave us a sense of what Solus as a product could be. So we said, okay, fine. So let's say we treat each customer as a segment of one. What are the various kinds of things you need to be able to do? You need to be able to decide what to do with them, which typically means building a campaign management system and so on and so forth, which is essentially the skeleton and the muscles and the cartilage of the system. Okay. And you also need on top of it some intelligence, which allows you to decide, for instance, whom to talk to, what to talk to them about, when to talk to them. If you have a bunch of options in front of you, which of those to choose? And that became the brain of the system. So you had to build the whole body and you had to build the brain. You couldn't just build one of these. So things started coming together, and that's pretty much how the product took shape. And it's while building it, I think we realized a number of things. One is that you're not building anything very spectacularly new, but putting all the pieces together and making sure that they all work, that's a lot of work.
It's interesting you're talking about these are some things that many people do in marketing. And so I know one of the areas that I remember really back in some of the early days, some discussions about what we in marketing refer to as the cold start problem, where we know next to nothing about a new customer. What are your thoughts about how that problem plays out in reality?
So we tend to think of this problem very often in binaries, that we have a cold start where we know nothing about the customer or very little about the customer. And then we think of the other extreme, which is typically the dream scenario that people talk about when they talk about personalization. So whenever you hear hyper personalization as a story being marketed, what is marketed is the dream scenario, which is that you know everything about what this customer is doing, what their interests are, what their current intent to purchase is, and so on and so forth. And you're able to bring all of these insights together to make that one pinpointed suggestion that really hits it out of the park. Now, this rarely happens, right? So, there's cold start, but then there's degrees of coldness. This Antarctica in winter cold, which is that somebody just logged into your website or came to your website for the first time. It's not even like they were referred from a search result on Google or something. They just got onto your website. You know absolutely nothing about them, and you still want to see whether or not you can make their experience somewhat interesting. Okay. Then you've got Scandinavia and winter cold, which is that they've come a few times and you've just gotten an idea that they've done some activity on your website, and that's pretty much all you know. Okay, you get a little warmer, and then you start getting to these scenarios, for instance, where a customer has probably come and done one transaction, and that's the data you have. And one of the interesting and not so often widely known truths outside of the industry in retail is, for instance, the fact that if you take typical apparel retail, about half of your customers are one and done customers. They come once, they buy something, and they go. If you're a menswear chain, maybe half of that group has come once, bought a blue shirt, and gone. And every working age male in the history of working age males has a blue shirt. That really doesn't tell you anything. So you're still pretty much in Scandinavian winter to fall at this point. So you keep these gradations going, and then at each stage you have, slightly more data until you reach, let's say, tropical weather. And that's about as far as I'd like to stretch the analogy, right? Now, what this means is you can't think of these problem in binaries and say, I have a strategy for cold start and I have a strategy for everybody else. You have to think of a strategy that's like a sliding scale. What it really means is something like this, right? That you want to exploit every little bit of information that you know, but with the realization that you know very little for a whole bunch of your customers. And then for some of them, you know a little bit more, which means you need to sort of balance this idea of exploiting what you know while still keeping the door open to explore what you don't, right? So it's like, for instance, you toss a coin, it comes up heads, and you say, oh, this coin just has heads on both sides. That doesn't make sense. You just tossed it once, it came up heads. You're going to have to toss it a few more times to start getting a sense of, what the likelihood of getting heads and tails are. And it's only after you've done enough of it that you know, which means that if you tossed it once and it came up heads, and you said, listen, oh, it came up head, and I'm going to exploit what I know, you're not keeping the door open to explore what you don't, which is that the coin has another side, right? So it takes a while to sort of collect information. So the exploration also means that you test. So for instance, if you have a customer who's come into your website the first time and you have absolutely no idea who this person is, maybe your best bet is to show them A, what your new arrivals are, B, what your best sellers are, C, maybe ask them questions to see whether or not they have certain preferences, right? So you're testing, you're trying to see what works. As you start getting some information, you can start personalizing. Sometimes you can personalize based on context. So let's say you've thrown up the new arrivals, right? Let's imagine, say, a menswear chain right now. You've thrown up some of the new arrivals. Guy clicks on, a pair of dark gray trousers. Okay, now that's a little bit of context that allows you to personalize. So you start saying, hey, people who bought these trousers also bought this particular shirt that goes very well with it, or this pair of socks or whatever, right? So you start using that information to contextualize what you can put in front of the customer, right? The more you know, the better and more pinpointed you can get, but at the same time you still explore. Let's say the customer's done this. The next time they come and you don't already assume that the only thing they might be interested in is trousers and shirts. Maybe you want to try and get them to say, hey, have you looked at our line of casual wear? Have you looked at our line of party wear, right? So sometimes that's how you find out whether or not something that the customer has not already shown an interest in might work. Otherwise, you're sort of locked into a particular trajectory and all you're doing is propagating that bias. And the customer doesn't really care about what else you have on offer because you're not putting it in front of them, right? So that's the whole idea, that cold start is very often the spectrum. So if you think of every customer as being at various temperatures and you say, depending on that temperature, as to whether you're very cold or fairly warm, I will decide how much to exploit what I know about you and how much to explore what I don't. And the reality is that even if you've known a customer for a very long time and you've really locked in on their preferences, it's still good to keep the door open to explore a little bit. Okay. Because who knows? Their tastes will change. Mine have changed, right? I'm sure yours have. So it's not even like customers are these physical objects whose behavior is governed by rules that Newton and Einstein wrote down. Their preferences change, the market changes, the environment they live in and function in changes, right? For instance, what used to constitute standard office wear a long time ago was formal shirts and trousers and so on. Post pandemic, people are far more okay with turning up in jeans and a collar t-shirt, right? So if that changes, that also means that if you keep pushing formal shirts at these people, they're not going to buy, right? So you want to keep track of that evolution. It means that you're constantly testing. It means that at every point in time, you're thinking that a part of your problem is always cold start. If you just think of cold start as a problem, then you have some strategies. But if you say that at every point in time for every customer, there's a part of the problem that is cold start. Okay, and how much of a part it is what varies, then you're better off. Then your strategies get a little more nuanced.
That is very insightful. I've never heard it expressed in that way, but once you express it that way, it's so intuitively true. Very interesting. Yeah, part of the problem is always cold start. If you're doing it right, if you're testing across that sliding scale. So you mentioned just now, and the example that you gave was a pretty interesting one of what's the new items. That's great opening gambit. And so we've got this, as developers, we've got this toolkit for personalization, and it really has everything across a continuum, starting with sort of ending with deep learning on one end and maybe various kinds of well-known ML models in the middle, all the way back to very simple rules-based algorithms. So as you look across this continuum and you're always testing, which of these or which combinations of these have served you best in personalization?
I'm going to break that down into 3 or 4 aspects, right? Let's take predictive modeling, for instance, which is one of those bread and butter problems that you'll probably find getting solved in a whole bunch of places, right? So this problem is one of saying who are the customers who are likely to do something, maybe buy in the next week or add something to a shopping cart or convert a shopping cart addition into an actual purchase or any of these things, right? So you're trying to figure out what's the propensity for a customer to behave a certain way, and then you're building models for these. And maybe you rank customers based on these scores, and you say that the models produce, and you say, okay, I'm going to focus on the top 30% of these customers because they are the ones who are going to give me most bang for the marketing buck at this point in time for this particular campaign, right? Standard set of problems. So it's very standard. Most people know how to build this. Uh, you could pretty much train a novice data scientist to do this reasonably well pretty quickly, right? What's happened if you take that kind of a problem is that most of your algorithms have reached, roughly speaking, an entitlement level, which means that if you do a good job on feature engineering and so on, and then you use, let's say, random forests or gradient boosting or even logistic regression or any of these methods, your results are all going to be roughly comparable, right? So you pretty much know what it's going to take to get there. So you know that the juice for the squeezing is actually in getting the features right, in framing the problem right, in making sure that the scope of this problem is in line with what you need to do. So really most of your value just comes from there. You take recommender systems on the other hand, the challenge might be slightly different, right? Which is that you have, for instance, very simple recommenders like just going in and running an SQL query that tells you what are the trending products in the last week or the last month, okay, by geography, by demographics, and so on, right? Or you could get very sophisticated and say, I'm going to build this big neural embedding engine that does fantastic things. It's all fine, but then out there, most of your value is not in building the recommender. It is in how you put it in front of customers. Let's take Netflix, for instance, right? Since it's an app that most of us are familiar with. We open Netflix, and when we open the app, we find rows of content recommendations. So your first row might say something like continue watching. Your second row might say, hey, because you loved this show, here are some others that you might love as well. Okay. The third might say, these are the top rated shows or the most watched shows in your region this week. Okay. Then the fourth might say, here are the new arrivals that we've got. Now, you could have had a very complex recommender in the back of this whole system, or you could have had a bank of simpler recommenders. But really, most of the value of the recommender comes from the way you tell the story for the customer, because you don't always approach consumption the same way, right? If you are looking at Netflix, you're not logging in and saying, I want to watch that one show that is for me. Some days you're in the mood for something funny, some days you're in the mood for something romantic, some days you want to watch people get killed, right? So your interests vary. You approach consumption differently. Sometimes you just want to watch more of the kind of content that you wanted to. Sometimes you want to explore something new, right? Which means that the way you tell the story varies. Now that is not complex technology. It's more a matter of putting a common sense layer on top of it, saying these are the various ways in which consumers approach consumption. That's how I'm going to put it in front of them. And at that level, it's far easier for a business also to understand how personalization works for them. Because when they talk to customers, they're not always going to say, hey, we've got great products for you, why don't you come in? They're going to find different reasons to talk to customers, right? So sometimes you're going to say around festival times, you're going to say, hey, why don't you try in India, for instance, you might say around this time of the year, which is when a lot of the festivals, the Hindu festivals come about, you might say, hey, why don't you come and try out our new line of ethnic wear, right? So then you've already filtered it down to a certain subcategory of products, which are popular at this point in time. And then maybe within that, you want to personalize what ethnic wear to show to me versus what ethnic wear to show to somebody else. Right. So most of the value that is obtained from these algorithms come in at that point in time, right? The other aspect of this problem, which brings in value but in a slightly different way, is the ability to explain how you went from input to output. And the reason why I say this is important is because when you think about it, Solus is a B2B product, right? Which means that we're building a product that clients would then use in order to be able to personalize their engagement with their customers, who are in most cases the end consumers. Now that means that in order for them to use any of these algorithms and make sure that it becomes part of their CRM process, they have to have the confidence that it's doing the right thing. Which means that the ability to explain how you got from input to output, how you went from a particular transaction history or a browsing history of a customer to a particular set of recommendations, to a certain extent, being able to make that transparent really helps. Okay. Because then it gives them the confidence that they can then proceed with this list of recommendations. Part of it is just doing a sniff test, right? Just looking at recommendations and saying, yeah, okay, this looks right. Okay. So if there's somebody who's come 10 times, bought menswear, and then the first thing you recommend to them is an A-line skirt, there's a fair chance that somebody's going to look at it and say, really? Okay. On the other hand, if there's somebody who's come and bought a diverse array of things and then you're putting something very diverse in front of them, they're probably going to say, yeah, okay, this makes sense. This computes, right? So depending on whether or not it passes the sniff test, you might cross a hurdle. Sometimes you're going to just look at the results in summary, in aggregate, and you're going to ask yourself questions like, is everybody getting recommended the same thing? Okay. So then you know something's right or something's wrong. Or you might look at the aggregate in a propensity model and you may say, are most of the customers I'm predicting would transact again coming from my deep lapser group, which means customers who haven't transacted in 2 years? Then there's a fair chance that the model is wrong, right? So does it pass the sniff test? Does it have some degree of transparency in going from input to output so that somebody who looks at it says, yeah, okay, this makes sense, right? So what we've really, come to understand as we've gone through this journey is that by and large, you don't need to build or invent cutting edge algorithms to solve these problems. Most of the algorithms you use are reasonably well understood. Like we take the genome algorithm that was one of those midwives for this baby, if you will, right? The genome algorithm is basically a nearest neighbor algorithm on steroids. Okay, you're just getting smart about how to compute nearest neighbors. You're getting smart about doing this at a computational scale that still works. So mostly that's all you're doing, right? Which means you're not doing anything complicated. Okay. The people who bought A also bought P sort of algorithm is again fairly simple matrix algebra. It's not rocket science. Okay. Most of these things are fairly straightforward. But if you're able to put it together in a very robust manner and provide a layer of business intuition that makes sense, then you're in much better shape. So I have generally come to the conclusion that for most of these problems, you don't really need to build space rockets, right? Most of the time, you need to solve the simple stuff in a very robust manner, and you need to make sure that it scales gracefully as you go along, and you need to make sure that there's enough accountability within the system to understand how input goes to output, and enough accountability in the system to understand when the underlying environment changes, the underlying consumption pattern changes, so that you can then adapt to these changes quickly enough. Right. If you're still recommending shorts when it started getting a lot colder outside, then you know your system is not adapted well. So largely it's getting the simple things right.
That's very interesting. I really like the way you describe the sniff test, what I sometimes call a sanity test or sanity check, but it is something that's very real. That's what we do, what we all do as stakeholders in the room. We do those things. We don't necessarily think of it as kind of a part of the process, but the way you really brought that into the forefront is very interesting. And the other thing I liked about it was you were talking about entitlement, basically the fact, and again, you're using things like, what is it, a random forest, or is it a support vector machine, or even a logistic regression? But people know how to do those things, and so that's not the differentiation. And what you were talking about too, about how you put that in front of someone, that really is, and the pipeline in front and so forth. So if we talk about those things, we say, okay, if those things are, let's say, conceptually easy, what are the things that in fact continue to be difficult, especially for in-house teams today, in regard to all of this?
I would probably say that there are two things that turn out to be a little difficult. One is just, it's not difficult conceptually, it's just tedious, which is setting up a robust process for the care and feeding of your models. Okay. The more models you build, the more technological components you put in place, the more technical debt you incur. Right. One of my favorite papers to have ever come out of Google is a paper that talks about the technical debt of complex systems. Okay. And it's a beautiful paper that talks about the various choices that you have to make in order to build such a system. And at the end of the day, the care and feeding of these systems ends up being fairly expensive in some form or shape. Right. And that's not accounting for the possibility that while you're doing this, the systems may not be adopted enough that it's still worth its while. So part of it is just getting care and feeding right and doing it at a scale and with an efficiency that the unit economics really work out. Because you've built a model, sometime later maybe that's not the model you want. You want to build a new model, right? You have some effort to put in there. So just figuring out how do I standardize certain processes in order to build new models very, very quickly. And how do I set it up in such a way that the performance of these models is automatically monitored, these models are automatically recalibrated? Because once you put a process in place, you don't necessarily need to keep babysitting it every day, every week. Okay. Earlier, I remember, and I'm sure even today to a certain extent this is true, if you go to large financial services businesses which have huge in-house data science teams, there are entire teams that are dedicated to building and rebuilding and recalibrating models. This used to be standard, and I'm guessing in a number of places this is still the case.
You're listening to the AI Master Group podcast.
Okay. Earlier, I remember, and I'm sure even today to a certain extent this is true. If you go to large financial services businesses which have huge in-house data science teams, there are entire teams that are dedicated to building and rebuilding and recalibrating models. This used to be standard, and I'm guessing in a number of places this is still the case. Okay. Even within airline solutions, for instance, there used to be in Sabre, for instance, there used to be a team that would regularly recalibrate demand forecasting models. Now, some of it is required because as some things change, you need to go in and maybe tweak some factors. But by and large, these are systems that can be automated, and you can then come in and add certain cutouts that allow you to customize certain things and so on, or maybe just focus on some things where something has changed. Okay, so putting these things in, putting a rock solid MLOps process in place is critical. If you're building a product, the other thing that becomes critical is just building very, very robust software. Okay. And this is something that I say with a full understanding that I consider myself part of the group that I'm describing. Most data scientists shouldn't be allowed near a computer without adult supervision. We are bad at coding. We're very good at doing it functionally. We can go from A to B. Okay. But if we have to do this at industrial scale in a very robust manner, we're guaranteed to find some of the worst ways to do it. Okay. One of the things that we need to learn as a community is how good software engineers build code. Data scientists don't build models the way software engineers build code, by and large, right? So for large organizations to be able to do this efficiently, getting that culture in is a very big part of it. I'm not saying everybody is bad at this. There are a number of places where people build excellent code. But I also know a number of cases where data scientists essentially just know how to go from A to B. They have that hacker mindset, and hackers are very good at solving a problem that one time. Okay. What you need when you need to build something that really robust is somebody who's, for lack of a better term, boring as heck, methodical as heck, right? That's a whole other mindset. It's a whole other muscle to exercise. Okay, it takes a lot of work to build that. The other part of it that I think becomes important for organizations to build in is a culture of testing. Okay, because once you've done your analysis and you've arrived at some insight, you tend to think, yeah, okay, I've solved the problem. Now I'll move on. I'll give you an example, right? So let's say you did your analysis just before Thanksgiving season in the US. And you said, okay, so these are the people that I want to talk to for my Black Friday sale. And you say you've done your analysis, you figured out who are likely to respond. You don't want to spend your marketing budget talking to everybody who's ever interacted with you. So you boiled it down to, hey, let me just talk to the people who've transacted at least once in the last year because these are the guys who are likely to come back. Based on your historical data, your analysis is rock solid. You've done this, you've done your campaign. So you've spoken to maybe a 30% subset of your customer base who transacted in the last year, and then you've moved on. A year later, your manager comes back to you and he says, do the analysis again, now build a model. You're going back 1 year, except now the only data you have is the people you spoke to, which is the people who transacted in the year prior to that. You don't have a counterfactual unless you go 2 years prior, right? So to some extent, when you do some analysis, you come up with an insight and you put it in place. Okay, you tend to freeze your conclusions. Okay, so it goes back to the earlier discussion on cold start. You constantly need to have a small degree of exploration. To some extent, you need to challenge everything that the data is telling you, because the data will tell you a lot. It'll be happy to confess to every kind of sin you want, but it doesn't mean that it's always right. It just means that this is what has happened. Okay, we tend to confuse it for a complete and comprehensive understanding of our customer base or of the environment. Okay, so building that testing culture in and making that a very integral part of how you do CRM, how you do any operation, that takes time. That's a big challenge, right? So even for in-house teams, that's a challenge. Building robust processes around building models and so on and so forth is one challenge, but it's reasonably well understood. The testing thing is a cultural barrier. I think that still takes time to put in because people are happy to do tests, but they're happy to do tests once, take those results and say, yeah, okay, now I've understood the problem. Okay. You understood it as of then. Okay. 6 months down the line, that understanding might not hold. So making that baked into your process, I think is the other big challenge. And that's cultural.
Boy, that is golden. So it's across a span of things. There's the testing culture, and then you also talked about the need for a software engineering mindset and also the technical debt aspect as well. All those three things are hard. And I think you used a better word than hard. You used the word tedious. You also talked about exploration in the sense of testing, but there's another kind of exploration that happens, and that is the customer's exploration. And a one word that marketers use for that sometimes is customer journey. There's a customer, they're on a journey. So what's a good way to think about this thing that marketers want to go after, the customer journey?
One way to think about this is like you're playing a game, right? So you make a move, your opponent makes a move, you make another move, your opponent makes another move. Eventually, the game ends with one of you winning, right? Now, sometimes a move could even be I pass, right? Let's take the analogy to how you're dealing with customers. Now, customers are an opponents. I'm just using it as an analogy to explain that, winning doesn't happen in one move, right? It's not like you moved the king's pawn and immediately Gary Kasparov was sitting in front of you and he said, yeah, okay, shake hands, we're done. It doesn't work that way, right? So you make a series of moves until you get to a win or until a win becomes reasonably obvious to both of you, right? Let's take an example of, for instance, selling insurance, right? A typical maxim that insurance agents might have is I get to have 6 conversations with my customer before he either converts and buys a policy from me, or we're done and this is not going to go anywhere. We're getting to the area of diminishing returns, right? What that means is now your game has 6 moves, right, from your end. The opponent, or in this case, the customer's moves are, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Maybe we'll talk again. Or at some point, the customer might just say, hey, this is not for me, all right? So you could lose the game well before 6 moves, okay? And after 6 moves, it's not worth playing anymore. And sometimes your customer at any point in this game could say, hey, this is not for me, let's move on. And then, the game ends there. You're not getting anywhere with this customer. Or you might say, oh, this is interesting, tell me more. And then you get to have one more conversation and try. Okay. Or the customer might say, oh, excellent, I'm in. Where do I sign? Right? At which point you win. Right? So your journey can be thought of in terms of making a series of moves until you get to that point, whatever you define as a win. Now, if you're talking about digital sort of journey, sometimes your win is getting that customer to one level further in a funnel. Like somebody who's just browsing, getting them to add something to the cart could be the win. Somebody who's added something to a cart, getting them to actually pay for it and finish the transaction could be the win, right? For somebody who's done one transaction, getting them to do the next transaction, that could be the win. For somebody who hasn't transacted for a while, getting them to come back could be the win. Depending upon which of these your objective is, your journey is now going to be sort of customized to that. Now, again, it goes back to the whole test and learn principle that I've probably beaten to death at this point. These journeys don't always have to be static. When you start building it, you might find that at any point in time, there are 2 or 3 different options in front of you. Okay. In most cases, you're going to say, okay, let me pick this option, let me go with this. And you're going with your gut. Sometimes that's right. Sometimes it might make sense to say, I've gotten to this point in this journey. There are 2 or 3 paths I could take. Okay. I could either be the one who I could either take the path that makes the most sense that most people take, Or I could Robert Frost the whole thing and I'd take the road less traveled. Or I could say, listen, I'm going to try both, right, and see what works. So part of the whole journey thing is to think of it in terms of, listen, I'm going to try out these various trajectories, see which trajectory works, and then go from there. Okay. The technical machine learning equivalent or machine learning way of framing the problem is reinforcement learning, which we've heard a lot of these days because it's become part of how, for instance, you train large language models, like with, OpenAI's GPT series or Anthropic from Cloud or any of these guys. A part of that training involves human in the loop reinforcement learning. You also find reinforcement learning in a variety of other cases. For instance, if you remember the the AlphaGo system that was in the news when DeepMind built it and had it play against world champions in Go. Reinforcement learning is a big part of how that is built. So game playing is very obvious. Okay, but you could potentially use similar principles in figuring out how to build out these systems as well. And this is not new as a technique in terms of being explored elsewhere. For instance, airlines look at whether or not reinforcement learning or dynamic programming and similar techniques can be used in solving yield management problems. Because there, if you're solving the yield management problem, you're really saying, I need to fill up the plane before it takes off. The moment it's cleared for takeoff, or the moment you've closed, your selling of tickets and your check-in counter is closed and so on, whoever's getting on that plane is all you're getting on the plane, and that's whatever revenue you're making. And you want to maximize the number of people you put on that plane prior to that and maximize the revenue you get out of it, right? So people have looked at analogs of these problems in other businesses. This is one more. I think journeys have largely been looked at in terms of fairly static journeys. I think there's room to make it more dynamic, more open, more reinforcement learning based. I think there's a lot of room there too.
That's very interesting. So when you start leveraging that and you've got these insights and you've got different, say you've got path A and path B, and path A, statistically is a better path, but now you're going to do a test and so forth. So you've got all these different decisions that you're making. They're micro decisions at the customer record level. I've heard you describe all of that as I love the word zoomed in perspective. And you also distinguish that from equally important, what you call the zoomed out perspective, which is, tracking KPIs and so forth and so on. So this is all starts to become very complicated when you think about how is it that technology might be able to help marketers to navigate efficiently between these two very different perspectives.
So I would probably again break it down into multiple moving parts. One is to think in terms of what is a marketer's action, right? What is that lever that a marketer can use? If, for instance, you take a business where you're reaching out to customers trying to get them back to come to your store, your lever is essentially whatever marketing campaign you're sending out. Maybe you're sending out a text message with a link in it that directs them to your website. Maybe you're sending them a WhatsApp message. Maybe you're sending them an app notification. Maybe you're doing something else, or an email, or whatever it is that you're doing. Okay. In certain kinds of businesses, maybe you're having somebody call them, right? So that's your set of actions, your outreaches, imagine, right? And you've got a broader objective in mind, which is that you want to convert a certain number of first timers to second timers, or you want to improve your win back rate from your lapsed customers or whatever, which is your broader KPI, right? So your zoomed in perspective is, I have this customer that I've already decided to talk to. What's the best thing to do here, right? Which is where things like recommender systems come into play, right? Where you're saying, I've zoomed in on this customer. Now I've already decided that I'm talking to this customer. What kind of recommendations should I plug in? What's the right language to use? Okay. What's the right day of the week to talk to a customer? Maybe somebody is a weekend shopper. Maybe somebody is a middle of the week shopper. Okay. All of those micro decisions come into play for that customer. That's when it becomes about personalization. The zoomed out perspective comes in when you're asking yourself broader design questions like, am I talking to the right broader cohort of customers? If, for instance, my whole objective is to improve sales in the East Zone because that has been flagging this year as compared to the previous year, then don't waste your time with a nationwide campaign. Focus on the East Zone, focus on what products the East Zone customers want, right? So getting the broader objectives right and being able to simply track the metrics that your campaign was designed to solve, getting that part right becomes the zoomed out perspective. This is also where you solve the larger resource allocation questions like, listen, I have this much of a marketing budget. How much of it do I want to spend on which campaign? When do I shut down a campaign that's not working well? And when do I double down on something that's working better? Right? How do I prioritize between various things that I talk to my customers about? Okay, all of those are the larger questions that you solve that can be linked to KPIs because your KPIs are aggregated measures. Your KPI isn't going to be, is Jim Griffin coming to the store again? Your KPI is going to be what percentage of my customers have done a repeat transaction within the same year. Okay, which means at that point, Jim Griffin is just part of the whole. So you have a much larger question to answer. You have an aggregated question to answer. So that's where you bring the strategic objectives in mind. So when you think from a product perspective, you need to have a way to zoom out and just look at these metrics and track these metrics and also be able to attach something to a campaign saying, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it. Now I'm going to be able to track whether or not I'm doing it well. It's also where you ask yourself questions around incrementality, where you say, listen, here's an option to do something versus not do it. What's the incremental benefit of doing it? Can I track this across a variety of options and figure out which of these give me better incrementality? Those are the ones I'm going to keep switched on and the others I'm going to switch off. Okay. This is also where you ask yourself attribution questions so that you know that when you're doing multiple things, am I fairly attributing my end result to these various things that I'm doing? It's a question that people in the digital footprint space understand well when they do multi-touch attribution with Markov models and so on and so forth. In the CRM space, I don't think it's been quite as popular, but bringing those concepts in matter. All of those allow you to get that zoomed out perspective. The zoomed in perspective is when you're looking at a customer and you're saying, what do I do right for this guy? Right. So essentially, that's pretty much how you sort of merge the two.
So, of course, it really comes across that you've got everything all sorted. At this point, you figured it all out. You've been working on it for many years. But I can imagine that you're already looking ahead to next year. What are the things that you're going to be working on, maybe from a technology standpoint? And you also have to make decisions. At a zoomed in perspective, there's probably some things that are on some kind of a list of one sort or another to do. And there's probably a zoomed out perspective that maybe encompasses what emerging technologies you've got your eye on. I'm not sure how you think about that, but I'd be very interested to know what kinds of initiatives are on your roadmap for future development.
Broadly speaking, 3 or 4 areas, right? One is improving the usability of some of this tech. Okay, be it recommender systems, be it predictive models, and so on. And usability itself has two aspects to it. One is building an interface that makes it very intuitive to configure them, to do little test runs to understand whether or not the results make sense before you deploy it, and just be able to get insights into the intermediate output so that you understand how input goes to output and all of that, right? So that's part of usability. The other aspect of usability has to do with resource usage because you want to do a whole bunch of these things. The number of decisions that a marketer has to make in order to run a successful campaign are very many. And you want to make all of these decisions, and each of them involves some kind of a compute footprint in order to be able to solve some problem. The intelligent aspects of this, like recommender systems and propensity models and so on, have a larger compute footprint. So just getting that under control and at a large scale would really help. Because one of the things I think we forget is, see, cloud computing has made many, many things easy. except spending less money on cloud computing. Okay. So in order for some of this to make sense for organizations over time, you have to try and build these things with a reasonably small compute footprint and yet not lose out on effectiveness, not lose out on uh, performance, on responsiveness to market trends, and so on. So, just getting a lot of that right is part of it. So, a good portion of our time would go into building a better UI and building far more efficient systems. Okay. For instance, we used to build code in languages like Python and R and so on. There's still some code in these languages. But then, we started looking at compiled languages like Rust, for instance, has turned out to be quite useful because code written in Rust compiles and runs a lot faster. It's a lot kinder on memory, so you could run parallel processes without breaking the system. So all of those decisions become useful. So there's a part of our time that just goes in building these systems in a manner that's a lot more usable, in getting a stronger MLOps system in place, all of those, right? Part of my time is going to go into some newer activity. Part of it is, for instance, building a stronger discovery portion, which is marketers make decisions based on insights that they gain from data, but how do you generate these insights by just looking at patterns in the data and telling people, hey, here are things that you do need to look at, and here is a way to solve these problems. So just enabling them to solve a problem is one thing. Telling them what the problem could be closes the loop, right? And then being able to link that to the KPIs that they care about so that they also are able to, go back to that zoomed out perspective. So that's part of the job. Okay. Then there's the whole journey question, which is when you have journey orchestration and so on, how do you bake testing into it? How do you bake maybe concepts like reinforcement learning into it? So that's one of those things that I'd like to explore. Now, with each of these, there's a phase of exploration where you try it out and you see whether or not it works, and then if it works well, you productize it. Sometimes you'll go back to the drawing board and say, I need to rethink this feature to the point where it makes a lot more sense and is a lot more intuitive and usable, right? The last one, of course, is the one that's on everybody's mind right now, which is generative AI. There's a We've built some generative AI functionality into Solus already. So simple things like, for instance, if a marketer wants to say, hey, I want to send out a campaign to people who have transacted within the last year and whose favorite category is kidswear. So you can think of it as a set of SQL conditions, or putting a particular condition and then and one more condition and so on. But ideally what you need to be able to do is to say it exactly as I just said it in plain English, and then have that translate into the necessary queries, and then give you something that's workable, that you quickly review and maybe tinker with, and then you're done. So being able to design marketing campaigns more or less through natural language. So we've tried to build enabling uh, architecture around that using generative AI. And I mean, quite honestly, a lot of the value we get out of these large language models is in their understanding of natural language rather than their generation. We are the ones speaking in natural language. What we want these systems to do is to answer back to us in structured language, right? So that's largely a problem for natural language understanding. So we're using that a little bit, but there's probably a lot more that we could be doing in making these systems a little more usable through the use of Gen AI. So we're essentially looking into how some of these large language models could help in building better systems. Okay. Some of it is also to just get a better sense of how mature this technology is and how much it can be used in these domains. The obvious ones are things like being able to compose creatives. And, you know, pretty soon after OpenAI announced the GPT series of models, we built a basic prompt engineering tool that allows people to compose creatives. But now we're trying to see what other functionality we can build into Solus based on some of these techniques. And I think that there's benefit there. What it also hopefully allows us to do is maybe start looking at customer feedback as a source of data, because that would be in plain English, natural language, and then being able to parse that and bring some structure to it and so on becomes another source of input that becomes useful. So I think that's broadly speaking the kind of things that we're looking at. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There'll be other things that will get added simply because when we talk to our customers, we'll know what it is that gives us a better product market fit. As we expand into newer geographies and newer verticals, some of these problems will bubble up. Some new feature ideas will bubble up simply from those conversations. And I think that will define the roadmap to a good extent. I don't think we're already a product that's so mature that everything else is just incremental. There's still a lot of evolution left.
That's very interesting. So you started off with some things that are just solid UI, UX, naturally, computational efficiency, naturally, these are good things, and naturally, probably they will always be on your radar. And then some of those that were quite, to me, seeming very innovative, the idea of being very proactive about suggesting to a CMO about what you should be leaning in on and bringing that forward rather than just waiting for the question, and also designing a very easy way for people to express what they want to do and then kind of transforming that. And I like your way of expressing that about the focus in that particular scenario is really on understanding rather than composition. All that's very interesting. Ramsu, I'm not surprised, but I would have to say that every single question I asked you, I came away with a big aha or takeaway, or you expressed it in some way that I'd never thought of it before. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation, and I am so grateful that we had a chance to connect. One last question I have for you: if anyone wants to get in touch with you to explore, any of the ideas that you talked about, what's the best way for them to do that?
LinkedIn is probably easiest because I usually check it regularly and I respond to messages reasonably promptly. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. As far as Solus itself is concerned, my ID is Ramsu at solus.ai. After actually having spent a lot of my career in organizations where they wanted my full first name dot full last name at something, it's been a real relief to have an email ID that's really small. So that's the other place to get in touch with me. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn or write to me on ramsu at solus.ai and I'll respond.
Perfect. Well, once again, Ramsu, I'm really grateful for this very enlightening conversation. I think I'm going to go back and listen to it multiple times because there's a lot of gold in this conversation. Again, thank you very much. I really appreciate our connecting today.
Thank you, Jim. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
You've been listening to the AI Master Group podcast. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. Until next time, stay curious and stay in front.